Welcome to another episode of NXIVM on Trial. I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times-Union.
How long have you known?
I guess I've always had my suspicions.
Allison Mack was a young actress with a budding career when she fell into the orbit of Keith Raniere, the co-founder of what purported to be a self-improvement organization.
But why do you think that's...
so emotional for me?
Yes.
I don't know, I think because it seems like it's something that I feel like I want it.
Mack became a member of the group's inner circle and was ultimately recruited into something far more sinister. Raniere's secret master-slave club, Dominus Obsequious Sororium, also known as DOS, or The Vow, in which women were branded with a symbol that included the initials of Mack and Raniere, the man known within NXIVM as Vanguard.
I understand that it's not just me. I'm sweating now.
Do you really understand that? How deeply?
Mack pleaded guilty to racketeering charges in April 2019 and faces sentencing at the end of June. A memo filed by federal prosecutors this week revealed for the first time that Mack had provided the government with audio of an explosive conversation in which Raniere laid out how the initiation ceremony for DOS should go.
The person who's being branded should be completely nude and sort of held to the table like a, sort of almost like a sacrifice.
Ahead of Mack's appearance in a Brooklyn courtroom, Times-Union Justice reporter Rob Gavin spoke with Tabby Chapman, a former NXIVM coach who worked closely with Mack and has one of the more unique stories to tell of her experience within the notoriously shadowy group. And one note, the day after this interview was taped, Mack's attorneys filed a document in which she said, quote, "It is now of paramount importance to me to say from the bottom of my heart, I am so sorry. I threw myself into the teachings of Keith Raniere with everything I had." She also called Raniere a twisted man.
One of the reasons I think you're such an interesting person to speak to really at any time about NXIVM, but with Allison Mack's sentencing coming up next week, you're someone whose story is a little bit different because we hear about NXIVM and we think so much about people in Hollywood or tied to the movie industry or people with a lot of money in Mexico. And that's not your story at all. Could you talk a little bit about what brought you into NXIVM?
Yeah, well, my, entrance into NXIVM started when I was pretty young. In college, I decided to kind of focus my career on developing like websites and community-based sites. So I had started this fan site for Allison because I loved the show Smallville. So I had started working with Allison's fans and everything. And at some point it just sort of became a natural, effect of Allison and I kind of partnering up to be, partners on her website. And the very first time I went to go meet her in person in NXIVM, it was hey, there's this program NXIVM that I really want you to take. And I'm asking anyone who works for me to take it so that I could make sure that I'm building this sort of ethical team of people. The promise, the lure for me in particular was, Allison had promised me that NXIVM would help me, fight this never-ending loneliness that I had felt my whole life. And so I thought, okay, well, I want to work for Allison and wow, I could get rid of this loneliness. And so that was my selling point,
And what was Allison like when you first meet Allison Mack? She's on this show. I have to confess, I haven't watched a whole lot of Smallville. What first impression did the character in real life, who in the fictional role was Chloe Sullivan, best friend of Clark Kent, how did she strike you when you first met Allison? What was she like?
No one's ever asked me that question. That's interesting. Magical, charming, wonderful. She was the kind of person that you wanted to be next to because the sort of positive energy that, well, I guess the sort of energy that she would exude was something that you wanted, like a drug almost, you know. Sometimes it was positive and sometimes it was very clearly, you know, filled with some negative energy. But even with the negative energy, it was so like charismatic that you really wanted to kind of be in her presence.
When you join, first start taking classes, it's in Vancouver, I believe, right?
So I moved from California to Vancouver to work, you know, more closely with Allison on her website and everything. We were always coming up with these cute little ideas of ways to engage her fans. And while I was there, I started taking, you know, ethos classes and things like that in Vancouver.
How close did you work with Allison Mack when you come to Albany? And what part did Allison play in that?
So initially, Allison didn't live in Albany. She didn't move to Albany until a little bit later. She maybe around 2009, 2010, Allison chose to start like purchasing real estate in the area. So prior to that, she was just sort of traveling back and forth frequently. Generally, I would see Allison every time she visited because I would help her with her website or with, you know, I'm the one that taught her how to use Twitter. And, you know, I remember that very clearly. Yeah. You know, so I worked pretty closely with her on those website projects or the little like businesses she thought of like Juicy Peach and stuff like that. Like I was working pretty directly with them. I think she had a poetry project. So anyway, there was always some type of project that I was working with her on every time she came. Since she wasn't my coach, we didn't have necessarily a reason to have direct access, except that once you're like brainwashed so much and you're given power, you kind of take access. So in other words, once she was like validated as someone who was sort of important in the organization, that's my opinion anyway, that like you can't help but to give feedback to people. It's kind of like that Stanford prison experiment, right? So once you get the power, you can't help but to use it to people. And I think that that's sort of really where our relationship, professional and or personal, started to take a severe nosedive. Because I thought she was going to be this safe entity that would make me feel that charisma, that charm that I had originally felt. But instead it turned into like adjunct criticism and feedback from the organization.
It's interesting when we look, and obviously Allison is being sentenced next week. I think most of us who've covered the case were aware that Allison had given some level of cooperation. I think it's fair to say that the other co-defendants, other than the notable exception of Claire Bronfman, there's definite cooperation. I think the Salzmans, both of them, I think we'd be fair to believe that there's cooperation there. When you heard that Allison Mack and Keith Raniere were charged back in 2018 in Mexico, and they're the first two, and you start hearing about DOS and all these things, what went through your mind?
Well, two things. One was, it was this dichotomy, right? So one was like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to think. And then the other one was, wow, this is not surprising or shocking at all. But I had to go through my own journey of like instant journey of reckoning, I guess. So, I had been like denying many, many times, oh, this is not a cult. This is not a cult. This is not a cult. And then we get to this day that Keith is arrested. And, I think it was a couple of days later that the indictment was unsealed. And then that's when we find out that Allison's in hot trouble and stuff like that. I was in a state of shock because I had immediately sort of placed myself in that, I guess, because I had been involved in the program in and of itself. So yeah, I just dealt with like shock. And like I said, also none of it surprised me because of what I knew of Allison and what I knew of Keith. The fact that it would get that dark didn't surprise me.
So much of NXIVM we now know came from Keith, and there are many little pyramid schemes, a lot of what they would call a pyramid scheme. Try to get one person, try to get two people, try to get three people to join. And DOS was the same way. And you obviously found out that some of the people who had joined were people you had been pretty close friends with.
Yes. In fact, I was, from my perspective anyway, I was pretty close when I was there with Nikki Klein. In fact, she's one of the few people that would still talk to me after I left NXIVM. And so to this day, I still feel like, what is going on? Because I spent a lot of time with them. And also I would just have to speak to the fact that, like, when everything was starting to fall out, if you will, and people were coming out of the woodwork, it was difficult to sort of know who was a DOS person, and because there's not a publicized list,
We've heard so much about Allison from testimony. When you look at Allison Mack, and based on what India has said and what other people have said, she's described as someone who could be very charming, but could also be extremely vindictive, extremely controlling. She did not come off well during the trial of Keith Raniere. And I say that because we heard former DOS members testify. And as I think the stories of the control of the various trips that were taken. Talk about Allison Mack and what it was like to be on the wrong side of Allison Mack, the darker side of Allison Mack.
The dark side. Like I mentioned, when I first found out that Allison was part of, or I guess one of the leaders of DOS, it really wasn't surprising to me. I'd spent a lot of time with members of her family. I was pretty close to some of the members of her family, and I had heard many stories that would not put Allison in the best light, but when you really stop to think about it and kind of draw back a bigger picture of what's going on, is this person who's sort of well rehearsed and practiced in ignoring their own self, their own identity and their own personality, and taking on other people's personalities. I don't know what specific part of that would lead to that dark path, versus just someone having someone having like a negative part of themselves that they have to embrace, right? But certainly it didn't surprise me. Like I said, there was times when my relationship with Allison was, great, like a good friend. And then sometimes even on a dime, things would be great. And then I would make a comment and this sort of like lashing out would occur. And I would leave crying with my head held down and, not able to really function for days. So it became this sort of intermittent reward system whereby occasionally Allison was so fabulous, that kind of almost that battered wife syndrome, although it's not really that type of relationship, but kind of like, oh, well, sometimes they're good to me, So yeah, I feel like if you're close to someone like that, you slide with them until you realize that, hey, this is no longer healthy.
When you look and you see her sentencing, based on what you know about NXIVM and Allison's role, what was your reaction when you heard that the government asked Judge Nicholas Garalfas to show leniency to Allison Mack, showing that she had offered what they called some substantial cooperation against Keith Raniere and Claire Bronfman as well, and that she actually provided very disturbing tape, if you haven't heard it, in which he is dictating how women in DOS should be branded. But what did you think when you heard that the government was asking for leniency to Allison, to the judge?
My partner often points out that I'm a Gemini, so I always have like a duality in my thoughts to some degree, So the very first thing I thought was, oh, wow, maybe she can be rehabilitated. Like maybe this can work. And then on the flip side of that, I was thinking, depending on what her mind frame is, it also could be a very strategic like process of, well, if I do this, then I know I'll be probably given some type of leniency. And neither one is more important than the other in that case. But yeah, I remember feeling a little bit of relief that she did cooperate. But at the same time, I did note, and I think it's important to note, is that the government and the prosecutors stated very bluntly that there could have been more help had she like cooperated earlier. And I think that they didn't put that in there for fun. You know, I think that's an important thing for us to know.
That's an outstanding point, but when the government or a defense attorney puts something in a sentencing memo to a federal judge, yeah, that does matter. And I think you're right, that is a way of saying, look, she could have done more. And the proof at trial really showed a lot of evidence against Allison through the various witnesses. I'm not naming some of them by name because they were victims of sex crimes, but I know there was a woman who was an actress, and her testimony about her dealings with Allison, to say they were horrific, I think would be the right word. She was on Allison's request and Keith's orders driven to a location in Knox Woods where she was stripped, blindfolded, and held down and sexually assaulted by another member of DOS, who obviously was also being instructed by Keith Raniere. And Allison was part and parcel with all these things. And so these are very serious charges. But as we also know, federal prosecutors, and in the Eastern District of New York, which is Brooklyn, there's a long history, organized crime cases. Sometimes people, when they give the goods, you get a good deal. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what Allison gets. What do you think would be a fair sentence for Allison Mack?
Oh, that's a loaded question. First of all, I do trust the judge that he's going to put Allison in the right place. So that's really like ultimately my answer. I feel like if there is a possibility of rehabilitation for her, that she should go into that facility for the length of time it might take her to like fully kind of shed this harm that she's, that's been done to her. Right. So I don't really know per se what the sentencing, I don't know how sentencing works, but I do know that if there is a possibility of rehabilitation, then whatever would facilitate that the most.
You look at yourself now, you are a mother, right? I believe you have twins, right?
Yes.
And you're a marriage and family therapist, and you are now helping others. You kind of come full circle, I guess. Someone who was looking for help, and now you're also actually giving help, and you also have the experience of knowing, obviously something that was put under the guise of personal growth. When you look at what was offered to you then, and you look back now, like, what do you think about NXIVM when you look back, like your experience with it? Like, what is it that first comes to mind?
When I look back at NXIVM, I look back at myself, right? As myself being a person who, my sense of loneliness, which I am coming to terms that this is a human condition as opposed to like a broken tabby, So when I look back at myself, I see like that lonely person who was desperate for, feeling loved and feeling like people cared, right? And I see NXIVM as a thing that did set me back, but at the same time, because I wasn't even really aware of of psychology, because I was a computer scientist prior to that, I wasn't really aware of psychology and how humans behave in patterns and things like that. I think it's fully what's led me here as an MFT. I'm still technically a trainee through this Life Source institution here in California, but I just have a couple more weeks left until I actually graduate with my master's degree. But I'm very, in that sense, grateful that I had an opportunity to kind of redirect my thought process from these broken thoughts, broken by other people, of psychology and the human condition and myself, and learn the real psychology behind everything, and learn how to really apply myself into personal growth through evidence-based research, right? So that is kind of how I view that difference in journey. Is the other one was just a whole bunch of psychological words that were sort of combined together to make them seem like they had authority. And now I've kind of been able to fix my thought process through my journey as an MFT.
Well, early congratulations on your master's. I guess, what was it that made you decide to leave NXIVM? I mean, now it's easy for us all to look now and go, wow, with the exception of those diehards, and they really are, they're hanging on, the ones that are still there.
Well, I had various moments of leaving. So I left in a sort of a phased approach, if you will. The amount of criticism and feedback when I was in NXIVM at some point reached this critical mass. I just couldn't really take that anymore. I remember when it started to affect my employment there, when even they used to make us write these, I forget now what they're called, but these notices or forms about like any mistake. If I was late by 1 minute, I'd have to write this form about how my tardiness by 1 minute affected, myself and the world, or the community and the world. And it was just this crazy way of thinking about simple human mistakes, simple human issues, right? At some point, it just became too much for me. I would just tell people, no, thank you, I don't want to hear about it. Well, you signed up for this, you became a coach, well, I don't want to hear it, and then people would proceed anyway, even though I would just literally say, I don't want to hear it. But the thing that got me away from Albany was a situation where I was approached by Claire Bronfman and asked, hey, we know that one of our enemies like intimidated you the other day. I'm like, how the heck did you know that? Because it's not like I'm going around blabbing it. I'm like, well, we want you to kind of drop this paper off at the county clerk's office. And I was like, what? Okay, and I just I felt this strong coercion to do this. And, looking through it and understanding what they're saying is they were trying to get that enemy arrested for like, quote, harassing me. And I was never the same after that. I felt paranoid. I felt like I was in danger, even though I don't think I was now when I look back, but I felt that way, and I just couldn't live like that anymore. So that is what eventually took me away from Albany. And then finally my last nail was these series of interactions between Allison and other people, like the other head trainers and things like that for Jeunesse, where I was again, the criticism and feedback was reaching me even in California. And there was a day where in front of a whole Jeunesse weekend group of people that I was just constantly being, told what I was doing wrong and given ultimatums. Well, if you don't fix this behavior, then you can never be part of Jeunesse again, in front of other people. And that was basically one of the most final things for me. I had to wrap up some things and leave, but my goal was to leave quietly and not leave with a bang, because I saw the litigation terrorism that occurred with other people. I found out recently that I was labeled as a suppressive by some of the people who are now out of NXIVM, who've never come to apologize to me or anything, but they were telling people I was a suppressive. My very first thought was, oh my God, that's amazing. I reached the likeness of Tony Natalie. And
when Tabby is referring to Jeunesse, it's the JNESS. This was the kind of like DOS, but before DOS, there was this supposed women's empowerment group. And it was at a Jeunesse meeting where Keith Raniere made a speech that was recited. So it was actually said by Nancy Salzman, originally said by Keith, in which he talks about, and then Nancy repeats, the quote unquote, how young children are quote unquote perfectly happy having sex with adults. That was what happened at a Jeunesse meeting. Is there anything I didn't ask you think you'd like people to know?
Coming from my now psychological perspective and being a victim of coercive control and things, I still see, and it sort of burns a little bit, people still making assumptions that, if that were me, then I would never believe this. And so just to kind of reiterate that cult leaders don't go from, hi, my name is such and such cult leader, I want you to get branded. That's not the way it works. It really does involve a connection with people that causes them to put down any and all guards of themselves so that they can trust these leaders And over a period of time, the leaders are sort of slowly walking them to their, like doom, if you will, not to be that dark, but sort of to their doom, and now they're at this, like, figuratively speaking, this precipice of doom, and like, well, are you going to do it? And I smiled. You guys can't see my smile, but are you going to do it? And people make their choices then, but not because they're making a choice to do it. It's because the journey to get there had been so severely altered in their perception. So when people say, well, if that were me, I would never do it. Well, you wouldn't. You're right. You would never do that, because they're not going to come to you and say, hey, get a brand right away. They're going to come to you and say, hey, do you like breakfast? Let's go have some breakfast. And slowly this insidious process happens. But yeah, that's the main thing. I think as I look out into, like, Twitterverse and all the other websites that I see, a lot of people, it can be a little destructive for anyone who has experienced any type of coercive control. And there's a lot out there. Domestic violence relationships, churches, things like that. There's a lot out there. So I think it's important to just kind of keep reiterating that.
You've been listening to NXIVM on Trial, a Times Union podcast produced by Jessica Marshall. Thanks to Tabby Chapman, and as always, to Times Union Justice reporter Rob Gavin. Please remember that the Times Union's journalism is supported by its subscribers. I'm Casey Seiler. Thanks for listening, and please check back for more developments in the weeks to come.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times Union member today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe